What is going on, guys? So we are almost ready to start working on getting the transmission off. We got the whole exhaust system off. Now before we can start pulling the trans, we do have to pull a couple things off of it first. The first one, the main one, being the drive shaft. So I have the drive shaft here. It is connected at the back of the differential right there. It's got a center support bearing in the middle, and it is attached to the back of the transmission, so we're going to have to undo those guys. So we're going to go after these guys on the back first, and then we're going to undo these guys at the back of the transmission. So that's your cross member right there, and this is the flex disc where it bolts onto there. And then we're going to go after the center support bearing, which is right in the middle. Now, because these bolts are on all the way around up at the top, we are going to have to rotate this as we're undoing the bolts. So to have the car in neutral and to be able to rotate the drive shaft, the wheels have to be able to spin to be able to rotate that drive shaft. So if you're doing this on wheel ramps, you are definitely going to have to jack up the back end. I have it jacked up by the differential just to allow the wheels to spin, otherwise you're not going to get that drive shaft to spin. Alright, so we will be using a handful of tools for this step, and a lot of them will be used for multiple parts. So lowering the transmission down requires a 13, so does removing the oil cooler, stuff like that. So a lot of these tools are used on different parts of the job. So to start, we got two 3/8 drivers there. Now the first one is used for quite a few things, but the second one is there so when we're removing the torque converter bolts. One is for rotating the crank and holding the crank in position while we remove the torque converter bolts, and the other one is for removing the torque converter bolts itself. So you don't necessarily have to have two 3/8 drivers, because the second one is going to have a 22mm socket on it. If you have a 22mm box end wrench, that works just as well for holding the crank in position. Got a 13mm wrench, that is for removing the shifter linkage. Got a 10mm socket. The bolts that hold the oil cooler onto the chassis and the subframe are 10mm. We got two 16mm wrenches. One of the brackets that hold the shift linkage on has two nuts on it, and they're both 16, so you do need two to sort of wrench it off. We got a 1/4 inch driver down there and a 13mm socket, along with an extension that is for removing the oil cooler. Of course, you can use a 13mm on a 3/8 driver. You'll just have to lower the transmission down before you start removing the oil cooler. I'll go through that later in the video. Got a 17mm for removing the torque converter bolts, and I got a 13mm there for removing the cross member housing bolts. I also used a flathead screwdriver, that is for removing the radiator mounts, because I had to pull my transmission oil cooler out the top instead of out the bottom. If you have a giant skid plate like I do, you might need to go that route, but if you don't, it'll just drop right out the bottom. You don't even need that. Got an 18mm open-ended wrench there, that is for holding the drive shaft bolts on the flex disc side. I got an 18mm impact, a 1/2 inch swivel, a 1/2 inch impact. So the impact, the swivel, and the 18mm socket were both all in combination to get the drive shaft off. You can do it by hand, but those bolts are on pretty tight, so I recommend using an impact. Alright, that's two. Alright, so now we're going to start taking the drive shaft off of the flex disc end. Because I can get my 18mm wrench, I can get it on the end of the nut without removing the cross member. Now, you can remove the cross member to start getting these nuts off. I would recommend that if you can't get a box end wrench under here like this. So if you're going to take the cross member off, be sure to put a jack underneath the transmission to hold it up, otherwise it's just going to drop down and be ugly. Alright, so I got a little swivel on the impact. We're going to get that on there. Get our wrench. Nice on that. There we go. Transmission in neutral. I'm going to rotate that around. Let's get that guy on. We'll get that hooked. And that is the last one right there. Now that should be free to slide. Very nice. Alright, so we got the drive shaft off on that end. We got it off on that end on the diff too. All is left of this center support bearing right here. And these guys are both 13. Now you're going to want to be careful when pulling this guy out, because he's going to want to drop. So if you bend him down, you can sort of wiggle him out on one end and then pull him out on the other. That's it, our drive shaft is out. Very nice. Alright, so the next thing we got to start taking off before we take off the trans is the transmission oil cooler. So for reference, this is the back of the transmission. Here is the transmission cross member. Here's the transmission pan, all that good stuff. So in a second, we're going to be basically zooming in right up in this little hole right here. So here's your shifter linkage. Right above that, there are two lines coming off that run to the front of the car for the transmission oil cooler, and we're basically going to be taking this guy off. Now, forewarning, I am using a 1/4 inch with a 13 mil on it, and it is even a little bit tight in that spot. If you don't have these tools, if you have like a 3/8 driver or something like that, what you can do, and we'll do this in a second, is put a jack under the transmission, and then we're going to unbolt the transmission cross member on all four. We're going to lower the jack down, and it's going to bring the transmission and sort of tilt it down a little bit to take it off. When you do that, if you can't get at these bolts now for that, you can get them off when the transmission is lowered down. It's going to be a little bit easier to get a bigger wrench in there aside from one of these. Because I have this guy, I'm going to do it now. It does have to be done at some point, but it doesn't have to be done in this order. So if you can't get your tools in there to get this guy off now, you can get it when we lower the transmission down. We are going to lower it down to take off the electrical connection. So when we get to that, you can do this as well. Now, something else to keep in mind, because there is transmission fluid inside these lines that we're about to crack open, I am going to put a catch underneath it so that trans fluid is not going to drain all over the floor and get all over the shop. So here's the end of the transmission pan, and we're going to go right up in here and zoom in on that. And so these two lines are the feed line and the return line for the transmission oil cooler, and there's a 13 millimeter just chilling right in between them, and we're going to run that guy off and hopefully pop those lines out. Alright, there are the lines popped off. So once that guy is disconnected, here's the driver's side lower control arm, here's the oil pan. Right on top of here we have a little mounting bracket for that oil cooler. So we're going to have to get that guy off, and there's a nut right on top of here, and it is a 10 millimeter. And I'm going to go over the control arm. Alright, that guy is off. And then in addition to that, this is the sway bar right on the driver's side, right underneath that. That nut right there is also holding on that transmission oil cooler. So we're going to spin that guy off. There we go, that guy is loose. Alright, so in addition to that oil cooler being attached on the bottom there, it's also attached up top here. So to get this guy off, there are two little clips, one here and one over here that I would just pry those guys off with a flathead screwdriver, but this car doesn't really have any. So we have screws here, 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 and here that all need to come off to get this guy out. This guy is going to lift up. So at this point on an OE radiator, the oil cooler would be sort of mounted to it, and I believe it has some flat heads that you need to get out. But because this does have an aftermarket radiator, I did not put this in, but it is zip tied right here. So mine is actually zip tied. Your guys' is most likely going to be bolted in if you do have an OE radiator. I'm going to go ahead and cut this. The oil cooler is sort of vertical down in that direction, so we're going to have to slide it out the bottom and sort of fish the cooler out. Alright, so here's that under tray I was talking about. Now the oil cooler is up underneath this, so I gotta fish it out. Could just take it off, but I'm actually pretty lazy. So I'm gonna fight this guy out. The oil cooler, if you don't have this, will literally just slide out the bottom and you guys will be good to go. Of course, after you disconnect it from the radiator up top. Alright, so I did manage to get the oil cooler out, but I did it a different way. So if you guys have a hard time getting that oil cooler out and you have a skid plate on the bottom, you can try this. We got a flat head here. We're basically just going to move the radiator for a second. We're going to pry that down. We'll get this one going. There we go. And basically from here we can lift the radiator and move it out of the way. So give us some more space. So I was actually able to move it like that and then pull the cooler up through here. So that's just another option for you guys. Make sure to get the bottom of the radiator mounted back on properly and then get these clips back in. Now basically from here we're just going to put this guy back on. Manual transmission does not have an oil cooler, so you don't have to worry about any of that BS. Alright, good to go. Alright, so I did get the oil cooling lines out. That being said, I have a massive skid plate under my bumper that is aftermarket, so it hindered a lot of the movement I could have used to get this oil cooling lines out. Because most cars don't have that under tray there, it would be a lot easier to get it out through the front of the car, but since mine basically goes almost all the way back to the sway bar, I had to improvise and change up the strategy a little bit. So what I did, you guys wondering, is I broke the little plastic clips that connect the two lines together that we unscrewed with the 10 mil. Broke those off and I sort of pulled the lines back towards the transmission and bent them around the engine crossmember. Just kept pulling and bending until they basically came out. So if you guys are having trouble with that, that might be something you want to try. I also disconnected the lines from the oil cooler at the front. That also has a 13mm on it, just like on the transmission. These guys were definitely a pain to get out, but they're out. So next on the list, we got to unbolt the torque converter. So if you'll notice, this is the block on the passenger side. We have the exhaust manifolds that we just took the exhaust off. Right next to the transmission, there's this little metal shield right here. On that shield, there's this little rubber guy that totally just fucking flew off right now. That's fine, don't worry about that. Alright, we'll put that back in. We have this little rubber guy right here. Now we're going to pop this rubber guy off, and it's going to reveal a nice little hole. Inside that hole is going to be our torque converter bolts. If you're going to look in this little hole here, I don't know if we can see it on camera, but I got Arthur at the front of the engine. They 22mm, and he's going to spin the crankshaft and it's going to turn the flywheel, and we're going to get access to one of the torque converter bolts. So spin it. I stop right there. Alright. If we take a look in that hole now, that is a torque converter bolt. So Arthur, I'm going to go around and I'm going to undo these guys. I'm going to do them one at a time. Once I get that one off, Arthur's going to spin the engine, and then I'm going to get to the next one, and we're just going to go down the line until we get all of them off. So up here at the front of the motor, there would be a fan down here, so you guys can actually do this underneath, assuming you don't have a skid plate. Because I have an electric fan, it allows me to do it up top. What we have here is a 22mm socket on a 3/8 driver. Now, we're going to put this on the end of the crank pulley, the big one at the very bottom. And basically, we're going to spin the motor. Arthur's going to spin it while I'm down there looking at the torque converter bolts to get them off. Whenever I'm telling him to spin it, he's basically just turning the crank bolt. So right there is our socket, there right there is the 3/8 driver, and that big guy right there is the crank pulley. And so every time I'm telling Arthur to rotate it, he's just sitting there spinning the crank. Another thing Arthur's going to do is hold the crank in position. I don't know if this guy is going to want to try and spin. I can hope not. Nope, it didn't. Okay, so that one's loose.
It had a little bit of a spin to it, but I pushed down on it just to keep it in place.
Good man. Alright, there's one. Alright, spin it, Arthur. Right there. That's perfect. Alright. Alright, I'm cracking it. Ready? There we go. Alright, spin it up a little bit. Alright, there's number 2. Spin it again. So I got my guy on. I am pushing in 3, 2, 1. There we go. Alright. Alright, so that is number 3 right there. Only 3 bolts that hold the torque converter on. So now that they are off, that is good. So the torque converter's off. You can put our little rubber butt plug back in. Alright, so back underneath the transmission, here's the transmission pan. If we look right here, this guy right here, that is our shifter linkage. So that linkage runs all the way back up through the center console onto the actual automatic shifter itself. So we need to disconnect this guy from the transmission. So that guy is a 13mm, and we're going to crack him loose and run that nut all the way off. Then we're going to pop that little guy out of the back. Thank you. Okay. So right next to that, there's this little holder right here. So there was that nut we just undid, and then the holder right here. These guys are 216, and I'm going to crack them, and hopefully that should allow the line to get loose off of the transmission. Oh, there it is. Oh, there it is. Oh, can I get that? Oh, and let's pull that back and down. Oh, money shot. There it is. That linkage is totally out of there now. Alright, so now we got the drive shaft off, we got the oil cooler off, we got the shifter linkage off, and we got the torque converter bolts off that were back up here. The last thing we need to get off is the electrical harness for the automatic transmission. Now that's sort of back up here, and to get to that, we're going to undo these transmission crossmember bolts. These guys are 13mm, but before we do that, because it's holding up the transmission or most of the weight of the transmission, we're going to put a jack right underneath it. So when I start taking these guys off, off, it's not just going to drop down basically. And once these guys are all out, we're going to lower the jack a little bit. The transmission is going to pivot down, and then I'm going to be able to get my hand up there and undo that electrical connection. Also, when we start taking the transmission off, it's also going to be lowered on the jack, so this is the only time that I'm going to be undoing this cross member here. Okay, so there's one bolt right here, one bolt right here. There's another bolt right up here where my finger is, and then there's one more sort of in. You can't really see it because it's behind the jack, but it's basically the same layout as this on that side. We're going to need to take all 4 of these bolts off. Alright, so I'm going to start lowering the jack down a little bit, but I'm going to be careful not to completely drop it. Now the transmission should tilt down. That should be enough for now. Alright, so we are now at the back of the transmission. Here's the transmission cross member, all that good stuff. Right here, that guy is our electrical connection for the transmission. Now if you'll notice on the side there, he has this little tab, and we're going to push that down. There we go. Alright, so I did push down on that tab, and that guy is just going to come out and hang loose. Also, something to note is this wire under here actually has a clip up top here, so you got to put the clip up, pull the wire off. You guys see those little brass clips? So those clips actually hold that wire onto the transmission, and there are several of them across the top. So you're basically going to have to go in and pry those guys out. Alright, so everything is off the transmission that needs to be off in order to get the transmission out. Thank you guys so much for watching. Keep it fresh, and I will see you guys later.